This is going to be a bit longer of a video because it handles really the rest of the lecture, this slide, and then it details some of the artifacts that I highlight in the next slides. The Shang Dynasty is around from 1600 to 1046, so we've got a specific date when they're conquered, actually. So for our comparative purposes, that means they're around about the same time as the Vedic people. According to legend, and these guys, by the way, these folks are the first dynasty for which we have written evidence, so that's where we get much of this from. They apparently start when a chieftain by the name of Tang, T-A-N-G, defeats a group of people known as the Xia, X-I-A is how we transcribe that, around the year 1600. A lot of their writing, and you'll see this on the last slide, is on tortoise shells, and I love that as a written medium. We know some things about them from this. They used calendars, so this kind of gets into their technology. Originally they were lunar, but eventually they replaced them with a 365-day solar calendar, so they're off by about 0.24, that identified the two solstices. Because of that, we understand that they had a good knowledge of astronomy and math. They seem to have two different number systems, a base 10 like we do, and a base 12, very similar to the ancient Mesopotamians. Remember counting to 60 on your hands. They're well known for their bronze work. They made spears and axes, but by 1200 BC, there's evidence of horse-drawn chariots made of wood and bronze. Think about this. Chariots good for transportation, also good for warfare. People have not yet developed stirrups, so you can't ride on the back of a horse, but you can steer a horse and do things with your other hand from a chariot. There's several large settlements, and the textbook does a really nice job detailing them, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But the textbook particularly does a nice job with one of the capitals, Anyang, and the reconstructed plan, I think, is great. It was the capital by about 1300 BC. It's renowned for its walls, sensing a theme about important cities here, big walls, protect you from water, protect you from enemies. Apparently they ran for 4 miles. They were 32 feet high. They were 62 feet thick, again, rammed earth. Think about what that requires, the massive amount of labor that would be needed there. In this case, it's often slave labor, slaves coming from conquered people. The organizational belief of the Shang Dynasty was patrilineal descent tracing to a common ancestor. So what patrilineal, pater, father, means descended from the father. And extended families involving grandparents, parents, children, lived and worked together. They held property in common, but male family elders were the most important. They took precedence. Women from other lineages tended to marry in, but they don't really become truly accepted until they have children, especially sons, that pass on that patrilineal lineage. Something that is interesting and also frightening about these folks that reflects their social hierarchy is something that was called, or has been called, the death ritual. Members of the royal elite were often buried with a full entourage, including wives, consorts, concubines, servants, chariots, horses, drivers, personal servants, slaves, and a lot of this tells us that they believe social hierarchy probably continued into whatever happens after we die, the next life. The Shang state itself was reflective of families in that it was a patrimonial theocracy. And what I mean by that is they claim that the ruler at the top derives his authority through guidance from both ancestors and gods. And because of that, rulers had to find ways to try to communicate with ancestors and gods. And this is very significant in that this is where we see divination trying to kind of interpret the will of the gods coming into China, much like we saw elsewhere, especially in ancient Mesopotamia. One of the ways that diviners claimed to interpret the will of gods was they would heat either turtle shells or scapula, which are shoulder blades of cattle. They'd make them crack, and then kind of like palm readers read lines in your palms, they would interpret those cracks as either good or bad signs. There was a unified clergy that did this. And so there's political and religious power, again, combining like we've seen in other civilizations. No independent priesthood really emerges to challenge the kings in that regard. Diviners, scribes, priests, whatever you want to call them, are subordinate to rulers and to also the kind of the royal pantheon, the ancestors that that ruler represents. So for the Shang, their gods are really ancestral deities, people who have died in the past. And with that, when rulers die, they themselves become deified. They attain a godlike status. And they're ranked kind of in descending chronological order, so the farther back, the more important the individual is. The primary deity in all of this is somebody that's known as Di, D-I, and the high god, known as Shangdi, was the founding ancestor of this royal family. These folks didn't invent writing for China, but they perfected it. And the primary evidence we have for their writing is something known as oracle bones. Other records were probably written on things that just don't hold up, don't stand the test of time, that erode over time. So kind of accidents in preservation, material used, may explain the major differences in ancient texts in China and other societies that we've seen that use things like cuneiform or clay tablets to record things like economic transactions, literary and religious documents, historical records. Based on what we have, the divinations discuss a variety of things. In the 12th through 11th century, the environment changes. China enters a warmer and a wetter climatological period, and lots of the divinations aim at predicting rainfall for sustaining crops, things like millet. So priests themselves are kind of seen in this role where they are pivots between ancestors and royal descendants. Like we're going to see in Persia, later Shang rulers use and then they enlarge a increasingly powerful bureaucracy to control a big area. Take a look at the map here. They've got to have trained officials who know how to read and write, take records, extract tribute, think taxes, to promote central authority over those farther regions. And there's tons of imperial records related to food, wine, bronze vessels, livestock. All these things point to a really powerful central royal household. During this period, an original, what we call archaic, old script evolves into something that is a little bit more manageable. We call it a pre-classical script. And this kind of precedes what we think about in terms of kanji, that character script that really endures among elite Chinese all the way to the present day. This is one of the key differences between these folks, the Chinese and also then Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese cultures, and Mesopotamian and Mediterranean cultures, is that they hang on to this pictographic, the symbolic-based writing. And again, think about what that means. If you're going to learn thousands of different symbols and know how to write them well, that takes lots of training. It takes lots of education. It takes a good mind. It also means that fewer people are going to be able to read and write. So if reading and writing is access to knowledge, that access is going to be much more limited in China, and fewer people are going to be able to do it. The Shang dynasty ends in 1046. The final king was apparently a very cruel man, tortured both enemies and his own inhabitants alike. And another kingdom from the west kind of smelled that weakness, marches to the capital with an army. The Shang king was so afraid that he apparently armed 200,000 slaves. That's the number that's recorded at least, hoping that they're going to supplement his army. Those slaves and actually a lot of the Shang warriors defect to the enemy. The emperor himself sets his palace on fire, commits suicide, and that really makes way for this new group of people, the Zhou, Z-H-O-U, to rule for the next 800 years. So that's where we'll pick up with the next lecture.